this gets to work. You copy from here, then just invite someone into this room. Let's see. Perfect, it worked. Perfect. So let's get started. Today we are starting module 2, which is the third module, and it's class 10, and this is JavaScript and jQuery. JavaScript, by the end of today, we shall be able to declare variables using var, let, and const or constant, and explain each's differences. We should be able to identify all JavaScript data types and identify and understand their coercion. And by the end of this, we should be able to write functions using all three syntaxes and explain the closures of these different data types. We should use all control flow structures and understand the true or false values, and we should be able to add the interactivity to our spot scope match timer. But we did this match timer some time back, and I said we would look at enhancing it in this very class. So end of this, we shall get back to spot scope and then we enhance the last thing we had the other time we were looking at Bootstrap. So first things first, let us look at the different key variables we have in JavaScript. We have var, which is just function scoped. It's hoisted and can be declared. You see, JavaScript was originally developed back in 2015, where it only had var, and that's not 2015, that's some really time back. But then after they introduced the let and then the constant in later versions. So understanding the key difference between all these three is very essential when you're going to learn the syntax of how JavaScript works. You see, let's look at the example on the screen we have. We have declaration of, we have a variable var score equals to 0. Now you'll pay attention that when we come to logical languages like JavaScript, like I said in a few classes ago, is we end with terminating with a semicolon. We've seen this with CSS. It's the same with JavaScript and many other logical languages. Something that is not true for stuff like Python, because Python is not object oriented at depth as compared to many of these languages. So we go to declare var, and then we said score is 0, but then we can redeclare score as 5 because it's not error in var. We can always redeclare anything. So if we created a logic like if function, and we say that if true, let me put it in our, let me paste this in our visual editor for better view. So yes. All right, let's scroll to the very bottom and we first see some of these things. Within the body, we shall create a tag, and this tag we are calling it script, where we get to add our JavaScript. Perfect. So tab. We were saying that with the first one that we have is var. We can always redeclare a var. For example, when we say score equals to 0, you can redeclare it and say, but it's the same score as a variable can be equal to, let's say 5, that the score is 5. Now, if we introduce a function that says if it's true, then var inside equals to I leak out of the block. If I leak out of if block, and then we close that. This function is so smart because it will try to show us that if we go into our console log, it will show that I leak out of the if block because var ignores the block scope. What are we trying to mean by this, that var ignores the block scope? It's because var is not limited to a variable that has been declared under var is not limited to a particular block, and it can be reused, repurposed as much as you can. However, we also have let. Let, on the other hand, is block scoped. It's typically the opposite of var. And with geez, with let, the blocks we're having an issue with our remote computer. There we go. So unlike var, which is block scoped, let is not block scoped and cannot be redeclared at any singular point. So that means it's hoisted, but it's not initialized. For example, if we say that let goals be equal to 0, then you cannot redeclare goals to be anything else because it's like a mathematical argument of declaring that particular variable to be that specific value you've given unto it. So if we let goes once again to be another value, let's say 1, that will cause us a syntax error because we cannot redeclare any variable with let. And then secondly, if we are to reintroduce a similar condition like the one we had, that if it's true, then let block var be equal to I stay inside. Our console log will say that it's a reference error. Block is already scoped, so it cannot be out of that scope. Now that is let. On the third instance is the const. Const, unlike all others, it just stands for constant. When you have a constant, it's block scoped, must be initialized, and cannot be reassigned. It's a constant, it's very strict on its own. So if we have a constant, for example, that says the maximum players or max players equals to 11, if you try to redeclare max players to any other value within that same block, it will say it's a type error. Assignment to constant variable, so you cannot assign it to that one. Then secondly, and this is very important, if this constant is with objects or arrays, let's say in a list notation, then the reference is const, not the content. For example, if you declared every time you have an array, just take this as gospel truth in JavaScript. Each time you have an array, whether it's associative array or any other kind of objects, then you should declare it as a const. For example, const, we have a constant which is home team Uganda and the score is 0. So if you want a particular thing from match, then we shall say match dot score equals to 2. It means that go under match and pick out the particular associative array for score and change that to 2. Now this is allowed because we are trying to modify a property and then not reassigning it. So it's a property within an already declared constant match. This is the same if we came here. Any computer? This is true because if we wanted to change anything within this object, it would allow, but we cannot now say that const match equals to anything else. So you can change stuff like you can actually even add some things to this very property. For example, we've only declared home team and score, so you can add more things to this array by saying the status is live, so and so is this, etc. So you can modify objects of this constant, but you cannot redeclare. this constant called match. Now, if you came out and said match equals to an empty array, then this is a type error. You cannot reassign the reference. This means if an object is already existing in this object, you cannot get it out of it, but you can modify it and add more. So that's how const is a little different from let and then variable. So when do you have to use each of these three that I've mentioned? You would say variable is just very general. It's declaring any other variable. Like if you have any variable out there that you'd like to define, and probably in the far future you will be redefining it, then you have to go with var. But if you're setting a precedence of anything, and it's scoped to that very block, then you need to use let. Like you would say in mathematics that let children be equal to 75, then that's okay. But if you're setting anything that it's addable into its own block but it cannot change, then it needs to be a constant. It's const. So let me give you an example. That was for objects. If you have an array for const players and it's an empty array, then you can say players dot push kadu. This is allowed because you're trying to add something within that array. So it will result into push colon kadu. Now, if you try to realign players and then you assign it to an empty array list, then that would also cause a type error. Now, there's something that we've kept on discussing through this entire class that is called hoisting. Let me try to get a proper definition for the word hoisting here. Hoisting. Hoisting is a JavaScript mechanism where a variable and a function declarations are moved to the top of their containing scope during the compilation phase before code execution. It's more of when the compiler of JavaScript is trying to run the script, it moves something to the top of its own containing scope for so many purposes. So this allows the function and the variables to be used before they are formed or declared. Although variables initialized with var will appear as undefined. So this is where this comes into handy. So getting back to our notes, we are trying to say that if we are to create a console log of hosted var, then it will say undefined, just like it has said in that definition, because var is hoisted initialized to undefined. So if you say var hoisted var to be hello, then that's it, it's gospel truth. Then if we are to create a console log of hoisted late, then this will also lead to a reference error because you cannot access before initialization. You see, this is a different kind of difference now this time around that I'm bringing in. With var, I've said it will lead to, we said that var is hoisted initialized to undefined. So the value is always undefined. Whereas when it comes to let, you cannot uh, hoist something on top of the scope that you've not yet initialized. So if you're to let hoisted let be val, then let is hoisted but not initialized. So it's just a temporal dead zone for that. But it's important to note that the first rule of everything is to always use const by default because it gives you some peace of mind. Yes, you might want to let things here and there, but under a squeezed mechanism. But as the code base gets bigger and bigger, it's often advisable to always consider constant as your default. So you can only get to let when you need to reassign something in the far future, or you never use var in your code ever again and just let it to be as dead as watching news on TV. So let us get to the different data types we have in JavaScript. This is not so different from any other language you've learned. We have, I talked about this in some of our former classes. We have string, which is any word that we need to take in its literal format. So if we say Uganda cranes in those double quotations, then that's a string. We have last time I was talking about having integers, which is number 42, 45, 77, as big as possible. But wait, before we say as big as possible, there's a reason as to why in JavaScript we have number and then we have big integer. I'll get back into that in a bit. We have what we call number because JavaScript sort of doesn't support much of floating point numbers. We only consider numbers. So if you say 3.14792, it's the same as it's same number as you would say 22. Then we also have a data type in JavaScript called undefined. Undefined means something is null and undefined. So it's a whole data type of its own. It's not null, but it's typically undefined. We don't know what data type that is. So most times this is an error data type, but it's there. You can assign something to be undefined. Then we have a data type called null, where it's associated, it's close to identified, but this time around it's to do with objects. So this can also be a bug. It can be an error in your code, but null is actually a primitive data type in JavaScript. So you can actually set something to be nulled in JavaScript. We have a data type called symbol. Symbol is a unique identifier that was introduced in JavaScript since 2015. You can assign something to be a symbol. For example, to better understand some of the different ASCII symbols that are available, JavaScript had to come up with a data type called symbol. Then some numbers are huge. They're in decillions, trillions, and they cannot be numbers because it will take long in compiling these numbers properly. So we use what we call big int or big integer. These are integers that are beyond the maximum safe integer for JavaScript to compile. We put those under big int. This would make more sense to you if you're trying to do computation around huge numbers of money. It would take long with numbers and to lead to errors unless you define these as big integers. So those are the primitive data types we have um, that can be immutable and stored by value when it comes to JavaScript. Now, away from data types, let's look at the different references we have in JavaScript. The first one is the curl brackets. These curl brackets you see mean object. I think you've seen that. Every time we have an object like we saw earlier at the top, here when I was talking about the different ways of declaring, when you have something of this kind, you can get to assign or associate an object to something using those curl brackets. You can say name is Najib Nassim, age is 22, 23, location is Dubai, and then so on and so forth. So that reference is called object. Now this one is for an array, but an array is an object of its own. So it's an object, but it uses array format. So when we're into this type of, when every time you see us use those box brackets, we shall be aligning each and everything to its own association in an array format, especially when it comes to Ajax when we are creating APIs. The third one is functions. We are going to have millions of functions, especially when it comes to object-oriented JavaScript. Right. So functions just help us to compute. We write the function name, we add the parameter of that function name inside the bracket, and then within the curly bracket we add objects. We add objects of our own methods. I want you to listen to this language very carefully. Let me first come back here to the editor. In JavaScript, we basically do this. You get to, let's get to this code. Because when we were writing some of these things, it didn't make sense. So let's get to the very bottom where we have JavaScript. In JavaScript, I've said we let something that will be reused. So here we use the let because we're going to redefine let's value by putting it on incremental. We have const, which is a constant which you can modify, but you cannot erase. You can add, but you cannot delete. And we used this constant because at some singular point we're going to add new values within the constant called live updates, as you saw in that code moving forward. Then we said there's something we have that is called a function. You see, we had a function that was called set interval. Under set interval, every single time we declare a function, we give it what we call a parameter under these brackets, of which its parameter was empty. Then right after that, you open curly brackets and everything under that function goes under those curly brackets as objects, yes, but these objects are methods. So that's it. Let's get back to our let's get back to this. We are looking at right, Tanika meeting in church, Tanika call. So we're going to look at the different type versions we have in JavaScript. The first one, so here we're going to basically look at auto converts of the different types that we have. For example, when you add into quotation marks a 5 and then you add it to a 3, it just concatenates. It just gets a string and then it adds it to a number so that these two become one thing. For example, if we said that let's add something new here, new text file, and then let's call it let's rename it. We are going to call it sample.js. Oh, let us call it class.js. Now we're saying if you have something like 53 and then this 53 you get to add it to just a 3. What have we done? Yes, good evening to you too, sir. Yes, Gorita has joined. So this is a string and this string is 53 and then we have a 3 which is a number. In this sense, if you have a string and a number, these are different data types. What it does, it just adds a pile of the two to make it one long string. So if we are to click run here, run, bring it. If we are to hit run, I didn't install Node.js. But ideally, what we are trying to mean here, for the interest of time, so this would just add up everything into So for the interest of time, this is what they're saying, that if you have a string 5 and then the number 3, kale Msumba. Mama alinganga bwe yatereeza network.